Somewhere in Tehran tonight, a phone that used to ring with coordinates and target lists is either destroyed or disconnected. And somewhere else in that same city, an IRGC officer who used to receive those calls is trying to figure out who is actually supposed to be giving him orders now. Residents across the capital were woken overnight by loud explosions. Air defenses lit up simultaneously in districts on opposite sides of the city. And for the first time since this phase of the war reignited, the fighting felt to the people living through it like it had finally arrived at the center of the country, rather than remaining a coastal, southern problem they could watch unfold from a safe distance on state television. Whether that overnight activity in Tehran represents a direct, confirmed American strike on Iran's most senior command infrastructure, or something closer to Iranian air defenses reacting to American aircraft operating elsewhere in the country's airspace, is a distinction worth taking seriously rather than glossing over, because the honest answer sits somewhere between the two. Getting that distinction right matters more than making the story sound as dramatic as possible, and it is worth resisting the pull toward the more cinematic version of events simply because it makes for a better headline. Here's what is actually confirmed. Central Command ended its evening strike wave at 9 o'clock Eastern Time, stating plainly that its forces had struck Iranian command centers, air defense sites, missile and drone capabilities, and coastal surveillance facilities, using precision munitions against targets in multiple locations, including Bandar Abbas specifically. That is the official language. It is worth sitting with exactly what it does and does not say. It confirms command centers were struck somewhere. It does not specifically name Tehran, the IRGC Aerospace Force headquarters, or any particular building inside the capital as a target. The only location Central Command named directly in that release was Bandar Abbas, the southern port city that has been struck repeatedly throughout this entire campaign and has become something close to a fixture in these nightly statements. Separately and independently, Iranian sources, including outlets aligned with the Revolutionary Guard, confirmed air defense activations in both the eastern and western districts of Tehran overnight, and international wire reporting included a Tehran resident describing being woken by loud explosions. Those two things, a Central Command statement confirming command center strikes without naming Tehran, and separate Iranian reporting confirming Tehran air defenses activated the same night, are being reported together because they happened on the same night, not because either government has directly connected them. It is entirely possible, even likely given the pattern of this war, that both are true and related. It is also the kind of gap between official confirmation and reasonable inference that is worth naming honestly, rather than collapsing into a single, more cinematic claim about a headquarters going dark. Because that specific claim, however plausible, has not actually been confirmed by anyone with the authority to confirm it. What is fully confirmed is the scale of human cost accumulating over this stretch of fighting. Iran's health ministry has said that dozens of people have been killed and hundreds more injured since this round of fighting resumed roughly a week ago. That is a source number from Iran's own health authorities, not a claim manufactured by a military spokesperson on either side, and it deserves to be treated with the same weight as any other confirmed casualty figure coming out of this war. Numbers like that are easy to let wash past in a news cycle this dense, but each one represents a household somewhere in Iran that woke up to a version of this war that a press release cannot capture. Also confirmed is Central Command's earlier action that same day. A lengthy strike wave hitting coastal defense and cruise missile sites on Greater Tunb Island, part of the string of positions Iran uses to threaten shipping through the strait. Analysts have specifically flagged that location as one of several forward Iranian positions, functioning less like defensible military assets at this stage of the war, and more like exposed, difficult to resupply outposts, increasingly vulnerable to exactly this kind of standoff strike. Separately, the Revolutionary Guard claimed it intercepted and shot down an American surveillance drone over a province in western Iran. The United States has not confirmed that claim, and as with most single-source Iranian battlefield claims throughout this war, it is worth holding it as reported rather than settled until independently verified. Whether that specific claim holds up is a separate question from whether the underlying capability exists. It is worth watching whether Central Command issues any confirmation or denial in the days ahead, since a confirmed drone loss would represent a real, if narrow, tactical success for Iranian air defenses, at a moment when most of the available evidence points the other way. Now the tanker engagement, because this is where the war's economic dimension and its military dimension are colliding most directly right now. Central Command fired missiles into the smokestack of a foreign-flagged tanker as it attempted to reach Iran's primary crude oil export terminal, a facility that handles the overwhelming majority of the country's oil exports to international markets. The vessel was disabled rather than sunk, a deliberate targeting choice that cripples a ship's ability to move without necessarily killing the crew aboard it. That is not a symbolic gesture. It is a direct physical enforcement action against a specific economic target, and it tells you something clear about how Washington intends to run this blockade going forward. not through warnings and diplomatic notes, but through disabling ships that ignore them in broad daylight in front of whatever cameras happen to be watching. The economic logic here is straightforward and worth spelling out plainly. Oil revenue from that terminal funds a meaningful share of the Iranian state's ability to sustain its military operations, procure replacement weapons for an inventory that has been consumed across more than a week of sustained American strikes, and support the broader network of regional proxies and allied groups Iran has relied on throughout this conflict. Every tanker turned away or disabled at that terminal is a direct cut to that funding stream, layered on top of a blockade that has already cost Iran billions of dollars in lost revenue during an earlier phase of this same pressure campaign. That economic pressure is not limited to Iran's own terminal either. A drone struck near a tanker at a major Iraqi oil terminal complex the same week, prompting a precautionary suspension of loading operations across the country's southern terminals. The facilities responsible for the bulk of Iraq's export capacity, among the largest in OPEC. It is worth being precise about the scale of that specific incident rather than inflating it. Iraqi officials described the drone as not appearing to specifically target the terminal, said the strike caused no damage and no fire, and confirmed that loading resumed at normal rates within a relatively short window. Nobody has claimed responsibility for launching it. That is a real documented disruption, but it is a brief, contained one, not a sustained shutdown of Iraq's entire oil export capacity, and the more measured version of that story is also the more accurate one. What it does illustrate clearly, even at that contained scale, is how exposed Gulf oil infrastructure broadly has become to drone activity of uncertain origin as this war grinds on, regardless of who is actually behind any single incident. It is worth noting that this is not the first time Iran's export terminal has come under direct American pressure in this war. Earlier in the campaign, Central Command struck dozens of separate military sites on and around the island, protecting the terminal in a single raid, deliberately avoiding the oil and gas infrastructure itself while destroying the air defenses, naval base, and control tower protecting it. A strike Trump described at the time as sending a warning rather than an attempt to cripple Iran's actual export capacity. This week's strike on a tanker attempting to reach the terminal represents a different phase of pressure on the same target. It is not destroying the port's infrastructure directly, but making it dangerous for any vessel to actually use it. A subtler, but arguably more sustainable form of economic pressure than a one-time bombing raid, since it does not require repeated strikes on fixed infrastructure so much as a standing willingness to intercept any ship that tries. Layer those three pressure points together, the terminal blockade being enforced with live fire, reduced Strait of Hormuz transit volume, and periodic disruptions at Iraqi export terminals, and you get a genuinely serious cumulative effect on global oil markets, even when each individual piece is smaller than the most dramatic framing suggests. Global energy markets do not process simultaneous pressure on multiple major supply nodes the same way they process a single isolated event. The uncertainty compounds. The longer this specific accumulation persists, weeks rather than days, the more a temporary conflict-driven price premium starts looking like something closer to a structural supply deficit, reflecting genuinely reduced physical availability of Gulf crude reaching international buyers, rather than just market nerves reacting to headlines. Now, let's talk about the platforms most likely involved in strikes reaching deep into the Iranian interior, because understanding the hardware helps explain what is operationally different about this phase of the campaign, while being honest about where confirmed fact ends and informed inference begins. Central Command, as a matter of standard practice, does not typically confirm the specific aircraft or munitions used in any individual strike. So what follows is analysis grounded in known American capabilities and publicly reported doctrine, not a confirmed account of exactly what flew over Tehran last night. The B-1B Lancer, a supersonic heavy bomber capable of carrying large numbers of long-range standoff missiles, including an extended-range cruise missile variant with a range exceeding 500 nautical miles, is the kind of platform that would allow the United States to strike deep interior targets without needing aircraft to fully penetrate Iran's remaining air defense envelope. Paired with F-35s providing the sensor picture, target identification, and any remaining air defense suppression needed to clear the way, that combination represents a meaningfully different strike architecture than the coastal packages used earlier in this campaign, which could operate closer to the targets they were hitting. Whether that specific combination was actually used last night is something only official confirmation, which has not been provided, could settle. What is reasonable to say is that reaching targets deep inside Iran's interior, wherever they were, from outside the densest part of Iran's remaining air defense coverage, requires exactly this kind of long-range standoff capability. And the United States has spent the better part of a decade building and refining precisely that capability for scenarios like this one. It is worth explaining briefly why a long-range standoff missile matters so much for this specific kind of target. Because the mechanics genuinely shape what a strike on a command center looks and feels like from the ground. A missile with that kind of range, lets the launching aircraft stay well outside the reach of most surface-to-air systems, while the missile itself flies the final leg autonomously, using a low radar cross-section specifically designed to make it difficult for remaining air defense radar to pick up in time to respond. For someone inside a targeted building, that translates into strikes that arrive with little or no detectable warning. No approaching aircraft noise building over minutes, no radar warning receiver going off in time to matter. Just an explosion where a moment earlier there was a functioning command post. That is part of why reports of Tehran residents being woken suddenly by loud explosions, rather than an extended period of visible air activity beforehand, are consistent with this kind of strike architecture. Even without official confirmation of exactly which platform or munition was involved on the specific night, the B-2 Spirit remains the aircraft hovering over every conversation about where this war goes next, because Trump has specifically and repeatedly named a deeply fortified facility in Iran's Natanz region as the target it is being held in reserve for. The B-2 can fly directly from Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri, penetrate contested airspace using its stealth configuration, deliver the 30,000-pound bunker-busting bomb against deeply buried hardened targets, and return home without needing forward basing anywhere in the region. That bomb was specifically engineered for exactly the category of target this facility represents, and Trump has said publicly that it is primed for what he has described as a big shot. None of that means a strike on that mountain facility is imminent or decided. It means the specific tool built for that exact job is sitting ready, and the president has said in his own words that it is coming. It helps to look at the shape of this campaign's targeting progression over its full run, because the sequence itself tells a story. The earliest nights focused on coastal radar, fast attack boats, and missile storage directly relevant to the strait. The following nights hit island positions like the ones Iran has used to threaten shipping. After that came sensor networks and communications infrastructure, the connective tissue linking dispersed Iranian forces to central coordination. And now, command centers. That progression is not necessarily proof of a rigid, predetermined plan laid out on day one, but it does reflect a logical military sequence. It is considerably harder to strike deep command infrastructure effectively before degrading the air defenses protecting the approach, and harder to degrade those air defenses before disrupting the radar and communication systems coordinating them. Whether this sequence was designed that way from the outset, or simply evolved that way as each phase created the conditions for the next, the practical effect on Iran's military coherence is the same either way. Before getting to Iran's own signaling, it is worth spelling out precisely why degrading command and control infrastructure specifically, as opposed to just destroying more missiles or more boats, changes the character of a war like this one in ways that go beyond simple attrition. A functioning military command structure does several things simultaneously. It synthesizes scattered sensor and radar data into coherent targeting decisions. It connects political leadership to the people actually operating weapon systems. And it allows an organization to calibrate the intensity and direction of its own response deliberately, rather than letting individual units act on their own initiative. When that structure degrades, whether through direct strikes on physical command nodes or through the kind of institutional fragmentation already visible in Iran's leadership since the killing of the supreme leader in late February, the capability underneath it does not necessarily disappear. Missile launchers, drone teams, and fast attack boats that survive do not stop existing just because the network coordinating them does. What changes is whether their actions still reflect a coherent strategic decision made at the top, or increasingly reflect the judgment and risk tolerance of whoever is actually holding launch authority in a given province on a given night. That is a meaningfully more dangerous and less predictable situation for everyone involved, including the United States and its Gulf partners, than a war being run by a single coordinated adversary making deliberate, calculated decisions, however aggressive those decisions might be. Now, what is Iran doing on the other side of all this? Because the country's public signaling this week has been genuinely contradictory, and that contradiction is itself informative. Iran released a detained American-Iranian dual national who had been effectively trapped in the country for months under what her legal team described as a coercive exit ban rather than formal imprisonment, after being repeatedly interrogated by Iran's intelligence services on accusations her lawyers call fabricated. Trump publicly thanked Iran for the gesture of goodwill. In that same general window, Iran's foreign ministry stated it has no plans for negotiation. The Revolutionary Guard continued firing on commercial vessels in the strait, and Iran's army spokesman said publicly that a significant portion of the country's military capability remains unused, warning that Iran's response could exceed what its adversaries expect and potentially open new fronts entirely. That combination, releasing a detainee as a goodwill gesture while simultaneously threatening escalation and ruling out negotiation, reads less like a single, coordinated strategy and more like exactly what you would expect from a government whose internal coordination has been genuinely disrupted. It is worth noting, too, that this single release does not resolve the broader detainee picture. Several other American citizens reportedly remain held in Iran, according to organizations that track and assist the families of current detainees, meaning whatever channel produced this one release is still, at best, a partial and incomplete diplomatic thread rather than evidence of a broader thaw. It is worth being careful here not to overstate what can actually be observed from outside Iran's government in real time, but the pattern itself is worth naming plainly. Statements this contradictory, issued this close together from institutions normally operating under the same government, are more consistent with fragmented, poorly coordinated decision-making than with a deliberate two-track strategy being run by a single unified command. On the specific claim of unused military capability, it's worth being precise about what that phrase can and cannot mean. Iran likely does retain mobile ballistic missile launchers, potentially including older Shahab-class variants, dispersed across its interior in positions that have been harder for coastal-focused American strike packages to locate and target than the fixed coastal and island facilities hit so far. Mobile systems do not emit the same persistent radar signatures that fixed installations do, and they can reposition between launches, making them meaningfully more survivable than what has already been destroyed. That is a real, distinct threat category still sitting on the table. But unused is not automatically the same thing as strategically preserved. Some of what Iran describes as reserved capability may simply be capability that has not been effectively employable yet, whether because supporting infrastructure was destroyed before it could be used, because the coordination needed to direct it accurately has been degraded, or because Iran's own leadership has not yet decided the escalation risk of using it is worth accepting. Distinguishing between capability held back by choice and capability that is currently unusable by circumstance is difficult from outside Iran's own command structure, and it is worth resisting the temptation to assume the more dramatic interpretation by default. There's also a broader dimension to this war worth naming honestly rather than avoiding. As Iran's military coordination infrastructure comes under sustained pressure and its institutional command structure shows visible signs of strain, from contradictory public statements to a supreme leader who has remained largely out of public view since his father was killed in February, there is a real and open question about what space that creates for internal Iranian political dynamics, including opposition movements and a domestic population that has already lived through a brutal government crackdown on mass protests earlier this year. What actually happens inside Iran as a result of military and institutional pressure from outside is not something that can be confidently predicted from strike footage and official statements alone, and it is worth treating that uncertainty honestly rather than assuming any particular outcome is inevitable. That degradation risk connects directly to the diplomatic channel this war has quietly kept alive, even through its most violent stretches. The dual nationals release did not happen through public negotiation. It happened through some functioning back channel, likely involving Omani or Qatari intermediaries, who have facilitated communication between Washington and Tehran at multiple points throughout this conflict, including the earlier ceasefire and the Memorandum of Understanding signed back in June. A channel like that depends on both governments having some reliable way to authorize and confirm messages moving between them, distinct from whatever military decisions are being made in the field on any given night, if Iran's command and communications infrastructure keeps degrading at the pace. This week's strikes suggest that diplomatic channel does not automatically survive the process untouched. The same fragmentation that risks producing uncoordinated missile launches from provincial commanders acting without central authorization also risks cutting off the very channel through which a negotiated de-escalation would eventually have to be arranged, if either side ever decides that is the direction it wants to go. That is the genuinely uncomfortable tension sitting underneath a week that includes both a hostage release, framed as a diplomatic goodwill gesture, and a military campaign visibly expanding into the infrastructure that makes coordinated diplomacy possible in the first place. It is worth addressing directly the language Trump has used to categorize this conflict, because it matters for understanding the campaign's actual scope and ambition. Trump has publicly compared the Revolutionary Guard to ISIS. That is a specific, deliberate categorization, not casual rhetoric. And it matters because American military doctrine and resource commitment against ISIS was built around sustained, comprehensive organizational destruction, rather than limited deterrence aimed at forcing a negotiated outcome. If that same framing is genuinely guiding the current campaign, it suggests an operational ambition considerably larger than simply pressuring Iran back to the negotiating table over shipping rights in the Strait. It would mean a campaign structured around dismantling the Revolutionary Guard's organizational and command capacity as an end in itself. Whether that is actually the administration's settled strategic intent, or simply forceful rhetoric aimed at maximizing pressure in the moment, is not something that can be confirmed from a single comparison in a single statement, and it is worth treating it as a meaningful signal rather than a confirmed strategic doctrine. It helps to place this specific week inside the fuller arc of the war, because the command fragmentation visible in Iran's contradictory messaging did not start with the tanker strike or the Tehran explosions. This conflict, in its current phase, began on February 28th, when Israel, working with American intelligence and air power, killed Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, along with a number of senior military and government officials in a coordinated strike on his compound. His son, Mojtaba Khamenei, was installed as successor within days, and multiple people familiar with internal Iranian deliberations have since described his actual role as largely ceremonial, legitimizing decisions made elsewhere rather than directing policy himself. The real operational authority, according to sources tracking the earlier ceasefire negotiations, has rested with senior Revolutionary Guard commanders, and a narrowing circle around Iran's Supreme National Security Council, while the Foreign Ministry handles diplomacy and parliament's leadership, itself drawn from a former Guard commander, serves as connective tissue between Iran's political, security, and clerical establishments. That fractured structure was already in place well before this week's command center strikes. What those strikes appear to be doing is degrading the physical infrastructure, the actual communications and coordination systems, that let a fractured leadership structure still function as something resembling a government, even an imperfect one. Take away the coordination architecture entirely, and what is left is not a unified government making contradictory statements for strategic reasons. It is several separate centers of power, each managing its own version of the crisis, increasingly disconnected from each other in practice as well as in structure. There's also a domestic political dimension in Washington worth folding into this picture, because it shapes how much runway exists for a campaign that is now visibly expanding in scope. Both chambers of Congress, controlled by Trump's own Republican Party, passed war powers. Resolutions back in June directing the president to end hostilities with Iran, a largely symbolic but historically rare bipartisan rebuke that Trump dismissed publicly, calling the Republicans, who crossed party lines, losers. Public polling from around the same period found only a minority of Americans felt the war had been worth its cost. A president moving this campaign from coastal infrastructure into command centers, and by his own repeated public statements, potentially toward a strike on Iran's most fortified nuclear facility, is doing so against a backdrop of real domestic skepticism rather than unified political support, even from within his own party. That does not necessarily slow the campaign down, and this week's events suggest it has not. But it does mean the pressure driving these decisions is not purely military or strategic. It is also being shaped by a political clock that is not obviously working in the administration's favor the longer this drags on without a clean resolution. Israel's posture through all of this remains a genuinely important variable that is not fully resolved either. Israeli officials have said publicly in recent weeks that Israel is alert and prepared to resume direct strikes on Iran for a third time if called on to, warning that any renewed Israeli involvement would come with even greater force than in either of the two previous rounds this year. Israel has not formally rejoined the fight as of tonight, but the American campaign's expansion into Iran's interior and command infrastructure this week is exactly the kind of development that could shift that calculation, particularly if the next phase of this campaign does move toward the fortified Natanz area facility specifically, a target Israel has treated as a core national security priority for years, independent of whatever the United States decides to do about it. None of this is unfolding in isolation from the rest of the region either. Iran's western border with Iraq has seen its own escalating, largely separate conflict this month, with Iranian strikes on Kurdish opposition fighters based in Iraqi Kurdistan killing multiple people in a single week, part of a longer-running insurgency that intensified after Washington briefly and very publicly offered, and then withdrew, support for a Kurdish uprising against Tehran earlier this year. That front is running almost entirely on its own momentum now, disconnected from whatever is happening between Washington and Tehran directly, and it is one more example of how many separate, only loosely connected conflicts this war has already generated beyond its original dispute over shipping through the strait. It is worth going deeper on the fortified Natanz area facility specifically, because understanding why it has become the fixed point, every conversation about this war's next phase keeps circling back to requires understanding what already happened to Iran's nuclear program once before. During an earlier, shorter war in mid-2025, the United States struck Iran's underground nuclear facilities using bunker buster bombs, a strike Trump characterized at the time as a limited, one-off mission rather than the opening move of a longer campaign. A preliminary intelligence assessment, one the administration characterized as a politically motivated leak, concluded those strikes had not actually collapsed the underground facilities and had likely only set Iran's weapons capability back by months rather than years, in part because Iran appeared to have relocated much of its enriched uranium stockpile before the bombs ever landed. Iran's declared stockpile of uranium enriched to near weapons-grade levels is believed to have survived that round of strikes, buried under rubble rather than destroyed by it. The deeper facility now at the center of speculation is a separate, even more fortified site in the same region. One American analysts have assessed sits below the reach of even the most powerful conventional bunker busters currently in the arsenal. Aside from the specific combination of the B-2 and the bunker-busting bomb that Trump has now named directly as the tool reserved for it, the command center strikes moving into Tehran this week, whatever their exact scale and location turns out to be once fully confirmed, sit on a trajectory that keeps pointing toward that same unresolved facility and the same unresolved question this war was always going to have to answer eventually. Whether any weapon in the current American or Israeli arsenal can actually finish what last year's strikes did not. Put all of this together, and the honest picture tonight is one of a war that has genuinely deepened this week, expanding from coastal and maritime targets into Iran's interior command and energy infrastructure, enforcing its blockade with live fire against commercial shipping, and doing all of that while Iran's own public messaging shows visible signs of internal contradiction rather than coordinated strategy. What is not confirmed, and should not be presented as though it were, is the most cinematic version of last night's events, a precisely targeted decapitation strike on a named headquarters in the heart of Tehran, executed with named platforms flying named munitions on a named building. What is actually confirmed is more measured, and in its own way still serious enough to matter. Command centers struck somewhere in Iran. Tehran's air defense is activating the same night in a city that had largely been spared direct fighting until now. A tanker disabled at gunpoint attempting to reach Iran's most important oil terminal, and a death toll from this specific stretch of fighting that Iran's own health ministry now puts in the dozens and climbing. Nearly 5 months into a conflict that started with the killing of a sitting head of state, this week represents something genuinely new in kind, not just in degree. Every prior phase of this war, however intense, stayed within a boundary both sides seem to implicitly understand: coastal infrastructure, shipping lanes, missile depots, the machinery of the conflict rather than the machinery of the state itself. Command centers, wherever exactly they were hit, and however precisely Central Command eventually confirms the details, sit on the other side of that boundary. So does an oil terminal that funds the state. So does the prospect, named publicly and repeatedly by the president himself, of a strike on the single most fortified nuclear facility Iran possesses. None of that guarantees a clean, decisive outcome in any particular direction. Iran's own leadership structure was already fractured before this week began, and further degrading its coordination capacity could just as easily produce a more dangerous, less predictable adversary as a weaker one. Missiles fired by provincial commanders with less oversight, rather than fewer missiles fired at all. Whatever happens next, whether that is a strike on the facility Trump keeps naming publicly, a slower, grinding continuation of exactly this pattern, or some diplomatic off-ramp still being quietly negotiated through the same channels that produced this week's hostage release. The honest read tonight is that this war moved measurably closer to Iran's political and military center of gravity, and neither government currently shows any sign of treating that as a turning point, rather than simply the next escalation in a conflict that keeps generating new categories of firsts without producing anything close to a resolution. The days ahead will likely tell us more than the last 24 hours have. Central Command's next public statement, whenever it comes, will either confirm or complicate the working picture laid out here, and the gap between what officials are willing to say on the record and what residents in Tehran are reporting from their own neighborhoods is exactly the kind of gap worth watching closely rather than filling in with assumption. If the pattern of the last 10 consecutive nights of strikes holds, another wave is likely already being planned if it has not already been carried out by the time this reaches you. And if the pattern of Iran's own contradictory signaling holds as well, expect another round of statements this week that seem to point in two directions at once. One gesture toward de-escalation, paired with one warning about capability held in reserve. That contradiction is not a communications failure on Iran's part, so much as it may be the clearest window available right now into what is actually happening inside a government whose center of command keeps taking direct hits. There is also the matter of what happens to the region's other flashpoints while all of this plays out. The Kurdish front along Iran's western border, the periodic disruptions to Iraqi export terminals, the missiles that have already reached Jordan and Gulf states housing American forces. None of those secondary fronts are going away simply because attention is fixed on Tehran and on the fortified facility in Natanz province. Each of them carries its own risk of independent escalation, and each of them complicates any eventual off-ramp by adding another party with its own stakes in how this ends. A ceasefire negotiated between Washington and Tehran does not automatically resolve a Kurdish insurgency that has been building for months, nor does it automatically restore confidence in Iraqi export terminals that have already had to pause operations once this month on nothing more than an unclaimed drone strike near the coastline. For now, what can be said with confidence is limited but real. The war has entered its interior phase. The economic pressure campaign against Iran's oil exports has moved from selective infrastructure strikes to direct interdiction of tankers attempting to reach port. Iran's command and control structure, already fractured since February, is absorbing further damage this week in ways that make its public statements harder to read as a single coherent voice. And the specific weapon and the specific target that have loomed over this entire campaign since the original strikes on Iran's nuclear sites last year remain, as of tonight, named but not yet used. Whether that changes in the coming days is the single largest open question hanging over this war, and it is one that deserves to be covered with the same care applied throughout tonight's update. Report what is confirmed, report what is inferred as inferred, and resist the pull toward the most dramatic available version of events simply because it travels faster than the more careful one. That is where things stand tonight, in a war that keeps finding new ways to escalate without finding, so far, any clear way to end.